Well, thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, and amongst the honoured guests, I particularly acknowledge my friend and former, I suppose you could say, First Minister colleague, Rob Borbidge, the former Premier of Queensland, Professor Leanne Ford, the former Governor of the State of Queensland, and Professor Ian Hoy, who served as well as his academic achievements. He was on the Prime Minister's Science Council when I happened to be chairman of it, and as somebody who was educated with a marked deficit when it came to science, I found, although I did do chemistry for the Leaving Certificate in Sydney back in 1956, so that must mean something, I found the experience of that council quite remarkable. As I'm sure many of you know, I was invited to deliver this lecture by my former parliamentary colleague Russell Trude, and for very understandable personal reasons he can't be with us tonight. It's fair to say, and I think particularly relevant to say, in a week that has seen a rather unusual but nonetheless perfectly orthodox and correct sitting of the Federal Parliament, it's fair to say that Russell Trude was a rather special senator for a number of reasons. He was elected as the fourth coalition senator from Queensland at the 2004 election, thus delivering a majority in the Senate, and I've put in brackets, on most occasions, exclamation mark, because no governing party can ever assume that everybody elected in the name of that party is always going to vote for them on every single man. Queensland has been known to produce a few senators who occasionally kick faces, and on both sides of politics, let me say. But he was elected in 2004, and it was something of an electoral miracle because on a serious note, since the enlargement of the Parliament in 1984, when the Senate went to 12 from each state because of the nexus provision in the Constitution, it means that you have an even number of senators retiring every 3 years. And it's well nigh impossible for either side of politics to win 4 out of 6 Senate seats from any one state very often. And that's why I'm confident in saying that I doubt that there will be any more Russell Trudes in the years to come. Australia's relations with Asia are of enduring significance to this country. The Asian region is, of course, the fastest growing in the world. The Asian region has come within the space of some 40 or 50 years from almost uniform levels of poverty and deprivation to contain in many of the countries burgeoning middle-class populations, demanding the resources as well as the services and the goods and the production of countries able to supply them. This university, therefore, is to be congratulated in inaugurating this series of lectures. And in preparing my remarks for tonight, I reflected, based in part on my time as Prime Minister, before that as an active and committed Member of Parliament, and before that as a lay student of Australian politics and world politics. I reflected on the various phases of our relationship with Asia. And as is apparent, I am older than many of the people in this audience and certainly the student population. So I lived through a period when our relationship with this vast part of the world changed, where our attitude towards people of Asian descent changed, our treatment of them, and our interaction with the various nations of Asia. And I came to the conclusion that there were probably, broadly speaking, and I don't try and do a demarcation by years, there were probably 4 phases in Australia's relationship, including the one in which we are now living and which I choose to call with some relief the common sense phase of our relationship with Asia. The first, of course, was the long colonial period, when Australia largely saw Asian nations, not entirely but largely, through the prism of the fate and interests of European colonial powers, not least in our case the British Empire. The Second World War, of course, changed all of this. Not only did Australia feel threatened by invasion, but significantly for the long term, the peoples of Asia elsewhere witnessed and absorbed the fact that it took the combined might of the Allied powers, including the United States of America, British Empire, and at the last moment the Soviet Union, to defeat an Asian nation, namely Imperial Japan. And as a result of this, a distinctive Australian foreign policy towards Asia began to emerge. And it's fair to say that an early manifestation of this was the Chifley government's embrace of the independence cause in what ultimately became the Indonesian Republic. The next phase of our association with Asia could best be described as the Cold War phase, when so much of what Australia did in Asia was heavily influenced by the mindset of the Cold War. It spanned Australia's involvement in two massive land wars in Asia, Korea and Vietnam. The domino theory, now derided by many, but widely embraced by most Western leaders into the late 1960s, dominated thinking in relation to the region. And it also dominated the thoughts and impulses of many in Australian politics. It was during this period that the importance of the United States alliance with Australia grew, to be epitomised in 1951 by the signing of the ANZUS Treaty. And this recognised for Australia that despite the continuation of deep ties of affection and kinship between Australia and Britain, Australians increasingly saw their security in the region as directly linked to the continued military presence of the United States in our part of the world. A symbol of this transition could perhaps be seen in the fact that Canberra followed Washington rather than London in relation to the recognition of the new communist regime after Mao Zedong triumphed over the nationalists in 1949. And that continued to be the case, of course, for a little over 20 years, and it would 2 decades later resonate in domestic Australian politics when the then Labor leader in opposition, Gough Whitlam, took what turned out to be a more far-sighted view in relation to the recognition of China. But having said that, I don't think it's right to pretend that our foreign policy was a total captive of either the colonial or the Cold War phases. Students of these things will know that in the late 1930s, when the notion of an empire-wide foreign policy held sway, the first Menzies government, in April of 1939, within weeks of R.G. Menzies becoming Prime Minister of Australia, established diplomatic missions in the United States, Canada and Japan. It's unrealistic in tracing the relationship between Australia and Asia not to acknowledge the significance of the Colombo Plan. It was launched in 1950 and was an inspired initiative of Percy Spender, Menzies' first External Affairs Minister. The Colombo Plan nourished generations of productive people-to-people links with Australia and the nations of the region. Most significantly, I believe, came the Australia-Japan Agreement on Commerce in 1957. John McEwen, then Minister for Trade, later leader of the Country Party and Deputy Prime Minister, was the driving force behind this historic act of national maturity and farsightedness. It was signed only 12 years after the end of World War II. It was opposed by the trade union movement and the Labor Party, as well as some industry groups. This agreement can properly be seen as the real start of the long and increasingly beneficial economic partnership between Australia and the nations of Asia. Incidentally, and with considerable relevance, 1957 was also the year in which the Treaty of Rome, the foundation document of the European Common Market, now the European Union, was signed. Less than a decade later, when Britain turned her back on imperial preference, the commerce agreement between Australia and Japan allowed Australia effortlessly to exploit trade opportunities with Japan following the discovery of iron ore in Western Australia. And the rest, as they say, is history, but it's worth recalling, in a sense, where it all began. In July of 1971, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger turned US relations with China on their head with the announcement of contact with the communist regime in Beijing. And this was consolidated by Nixon's historic visit to China the following year. As opposition leader, as I mentioned earlier, Gough Whitlam had wrong-footed the coalition government when he led an ALP delegation to China, and if I recall rightly, that ALP delegation included the late Tom Burns, son of Queensland, and then the federal president, I think, of the Australian Labor Party. The then government's criticism of this visit, the one led by Whitlam, was rendered particularly hollow by the Kissinger-Nixon announcement. Of course, it is right to acknowledge that about this time, something which, if it had not been addressed, would have represented an increasingly intense barrier to better relations between Australia and the nations of Asia, namely the White Australia policy, began to be dismantled. It's fair to say that the process was slow, but it's also fair to say that both sides of politics made a contribution to it, although its removal was initiated in the early months of the Holt government in 1966. It was supported by the Whitlam-led Labor opposition, although opposed by his predecessor, Arthur Calwell. This was an essential adjustment, not only on grounds of morality and propriety, but also to fully develop the relationship between our two countries. I call the third and next phase in our relations with Asia as the false choice period. And this comprises much of the 1970s and 1980s, where almost as if fascinated by a new revelation and experience, many Australians fell over themselves to identify with Asia, and in the process developed this rather foolish notion that the only way you could do well in Asia was to turn your back on previous associations. And many Australians argue that the authenticity of our embrace of Asia could not be properly demonstrated without turning our backs on older associations. And it seemed during that period, at times to me anyway, as if Australia were conducting a perpetual seminar on our national identity. This long period of domestic navel-gazing I found increasingly futile. The issue of relations with Asian neighbours even intruded into the gathering debate of whether or not Australia should become a republic. Discussion about whether or not Australia was an Asian nation, or part European or part Asian or Western or whatever, always seemed to me, and increasingly so, as a an elected leader of this country pointless and futile. As Prime Minister, I frequently said that Australia did not have to choose between her history and her geography. It is self-evident that Australia, uniquely in a way, is an outpost of Western civilisation. It's fortunate to live cheek by jowl with the most exciting and growing area of the world, and it's also a nation that has had a long and very valuable historic association with the United States. I celebrate that as one of the great elements of Australian good fortune, and the idea that we should have to in some way decide the order of priority or make a choice is facile in the extreme. I think I may recall that one of the senior ministers in the government at this time, I think the then Treasurer, not the best known of Labor's Treasurers, Mr Keating, I think it was the person he appointed, once argued that the presence of the Union Jack in the Australian flag hindered our trade with Asian nations. From the vantage point of 2016 and all that has been achieved on the trade front, such assertions must seem little more than comical. For some time now, we have been well into what I am pleased to describe as the common sense phase of our relations with Asia, and I hope that this continues indefinitely. Most certainly, most Australians now fully understand the lasting value of export markets in the Asian region. We all know that our nation suffered relatively little damage from the global financial plunge which commenced in 2008. It's commonly accepted that one of the principal reasons for this was the strength of our resource trade with North Asia, especially but not only China. And I was particularly struck with the effectiveness and the way in which the Australian community seemed to embrace the campaign run by the resource companies of Australia about what they saw as the deleterious impact of one iteration of the mining tax. So I thought it demonstrated, leaving the politics of it aside, I thought it demonstrated that just as Australians once knew how much we lived on the sheep's back, they had now come to accept how valuable our resource trade was, particularly with the nations of North Asia. Common sense, of course, which is always a valuable commodity in politics and international relations and economics, also should continue to remind us, despite the dominant position held by China in our export markets, of how valuable over the long period our economic relationship with Japan has been. As I mentioned earlier, our trading links with Japan mightily assisted this country when British markets disappeared on that country entering the European Common Market. And so the wisdom of what the Menzies government had done back in 1950s was amply illustrated and validated. I think we also now better understand than we did that there are basic political differences between the liberal democratic traditions and the more authoritarian character of government in some Asian nations. We have learned to understand that those differences exist, and we've also learned to handle the differences better and to understand that we can work together and coexist despite the fact that we do have a different approach to the government of our country as compared with the government of quite a number of our partners in the Asian region. The liberal democratic tradition, as we know it in Australia, continues to have, it must be said, a very mixed run against a lot of Asian nations. A standout exception to this, I have to say, with some feeling, has been in relation to Indonesia. When I became Prime Minister of Australia in March 1996, Indonesia was still essentially a military dictatorship under President Suharto. Now, unequivocally, it is the third largest functioning democracy in the world. And this is an extraordinary transition. And it's a transition for which our nearest neighbour continues to receive, in my view, insufficient credit. It was achieved with virtually no bloodshed, and it is quite remarkable in my own personal experience of dealing with 5 Indonesian presidents from Suharto through to Yudhoyono, just how skillfully the transition was achieved and how much I believe this nation deserves credit for it. It is still early days, but the transition to a more democratic system of government in Myanmar or Burma has to be seen as a source of great hope. It is early days, but I would not have thought that that transition was likely only a few years ago. By contrast, it has to be said that in both Malaysia and Thailand, the institutions have become decidedly less democratic than in recent years. Returning to Indonesia, it's right to say that our relations with that country are not only extremely important, it's hard to visualise two nations who are such close neighbours with such different backgrounds and histories and culture. And not only is the relationship very important, but on many occasions it has been complex and very, very difficult. It got off to a good start in the eyes of the Indonesians because the Chifley government did not side with the returning colonial power and offered the friendship of Australia to the people of Indonesia. But that, of course, was only the beginning, and it was to go up and down as the years went by. It's worth recalling, for example, that when the Menzies government reintroduced conscription late in 1964, and ultimately, of course, it was the reintroduction of conscription which was to prove so controversial in the national debate as public opinion later in the 1960s turned against our involvement in Vietnam, that the principal reason Menzies reintroduced conscription was to ready Australia for a possible conflict with Indonesia as that country engaged in what was then called confrontation with Malaysia. I think Malcolm Turnbull struck the right note on balance during his recent visit to China. He emphasised the massive economic dividend in the Sino-Australian relationship, but was clear, whilst tactful, in emphasising the importance of the rule of law in international affairs. In other words, he focused on the mutual advantages without compromising on principle. In doing so, I think he followed a pattern embraced by a number of his predecessors on both sides of politics. And no side of Australian politics has a mortgage on wisdom in relation to dealing with the nations of Asia. The strength of Australia's economic relationship with North Asia has naturally been illustrated by the conclusion of free trade agreements with China, Japan, and Korea. They cement already strong reciprocal benefits. Each is broadly based and ideal examples of what can be achieved by bilateral agreements. The bilateral relationship between the United States and China is the most important in our region and beyond. And just as I rejected the notion of choosing between our history and our geography a few moments ago, I also reject the idea of Australia having to choose between the United States and China. Those who argue that we face an inevitable choice do Australia a great disservice and fail to understand the true character of our national interest in relation to this issue. Our goal can only be to maintain close links with both China and the United States, whilst recognising that the respective partnerships will be different in character. I think on the foreign affairs front, I have a stronger recollection of 2 days in October 2003 than any other time when I was Prime Minister. On those 2 days, there was a joint sitting of Parliament on the first day addressed by George W. Bush, the President of the United States, and on the second day by President Hu Jintao, the President of the Republic of China. If symbolism means anything, and it often can and should, that was Australia saying to the world that it was possible to have close relations with those two nations, albeit of different kinds. The fact that the President of the United States, being very much part of the Western democratic tradition, was completely untroubled by the fact that he would be followed by President Hu Jintao, and was completely unruffled by interjections from a green called brown, something that I have to say the prospect of which caused a little bit of discomfort to our Chinese friends. I thought it was a demonstration of both a capacity and a maturity in the Australian nation. Australia will always be closer to the United States than China. The common values that bind Australia and the United States are stronger, and common values will always trump trade links. I don't know why I use the verb trump, but dear me. But we should be pragmatic enough in our relations with China, and this is a very important balance point, to focus on the things that we have in common and avoid gratuitous lectures. For a variety of reasons, relations between Australia and China became ragged in the months after my government was elected in March 1996. We got caught up in the Taiwan Straits dispute between America and China. There were arguments about ministerial delegations to Taiwan. There was an argument about the impact of the removal of an economic assistance program in our first budget. And it all did become very, very ragged. And I secured a lengthy meeting with President Jiang Zemin in the margins of the APEC meeting in Manila. And its aim was, frankly, to reset the button on the relationship. And our common understanding, both coming out of that meeting and in the months that followed, was that Australia and China should not pretend that they weren't radically different societies with markedly dissimilar histories and political institutions. Yet we had a lot in common on economic matters and increasingly in the area of people-to-people links. And it was agreed that for the future we should focus on those commonalities. The rise of China has been good for China and good for the world. It has liberated hundreds of millions of people from poverty in a short period of time. It has contributed to our wealth and economic growth. But as with any nation, we should not make the mistake of becoming mesmerised by China or of China's place in the world. She faces an enormous demographic challenge. To use an old cliche, China will grow old before she grows rich. Generations will pass before the negative effect of the one-child policy is eradicated. The strains unleashed by this policy will limit China's capacity to invest in alternative and more productive pursuits. China's wealth must be seen in proper perspective. As the American writer Robert Kagan wrote in The World America Made, by 2030, China's per capita GDP will still be only half that of the United States. That will be approximately where Greece and Slovenia are today. In the past, by contrast, the largest and most dominant economies in the world had also been the richest on a per capita basis. Then there is the democratic equation. China remains unashamedly an authoritarian country, and there are indications that this trend has not diminished under their extremely impressive and powerful President Xi Jinping. This will, however, be challenged, in my view, as growing numbers of middle-class Chinese will only have experienced relative affluence. Unlike those who have passed from poverty to comfort in their lifetime, this growing group will increasingly resent political control of the type now exercised in their country. And the process will appear slow, but in my assessment, the denouement is inevitable. As many of you will recognise, I am not the most ardent multilateralist to have occupied the office of Prime Minister of Australia. I strongly believe that we still live in a world of nation states, and I believe that remains the key organising principle of international affairs. It lies at the heart of the current dilemma now faced by the European Union, but that is another matter which I will not pursue right at the moment. Last year, Singapore, one of the most remarkable nation states of recent times, marked 50 years of independence. Against daunting odds, it has grown and prospered. As its current Prime Minister once said to me, "John, Singapore's only resource has ever been its people." True, it remains a good ASEAN citizen, but above all, one that pursued its own foreign policy. The late legendary Lee Kuan Yew never stopped advocating a continued American presence in the region, even when some of his neighbours argued that some of his neighbours equivocated. To the end, Lee argued that US involvement in Vietnam had provided time for nations such as Singapore and Malaysia to stabilise and grow. We should be wary of imagining that there is some grand strategy for dealing with Asia. The region contains countries of immense diversity, size, cultural and religious heritages. The nations of Asia are at various stages of economic development. Some will continue to prosper, some will falter, but the composition will always be very varied. Many are grappling with massive poverty, although it is in the Asian region where, paradoxically, so much progress has been made in reducing the absolute numbers of people living in poverty. Australia's relations, in my view, with Asia can only ever be the sum total of a series of very important bilateral relationships. Successive Australian governments on both sides have been correct in consolidating our strong economic ties with the three export markets of North Asia, China, Japan and Korea. And it is right for the present government to pursue a free trade agreement with India. The people-to-people links with that country intensify every year. I have not forgotten a discussion I had with the then Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, in New Delhi in 2006. He was a very thoughtful, reflective, polite and intelligent man And in a short two-person discussion, he said to me, Prime Minister, India and Australia have a lot in common, and we immediately thought of cricket, and we immediately thought, of course, of the English language and the federal structure of our two societies and a broadly similar legal system. He said, although we've got a lot in common, we don't seem to have had much to do with each other. And I thought that was an anecdote that provided much wisdom. And I've often thought, what was the explanation? I did, I suppose, being a little impertinent, say to him at the time that perhaps one of the reasons why we hadn't had a lot to do with each other was that during most of the Cold War period, the default position of India was often that of siding with the Soviet Union rather than the United States, at least at a diplomatic level. And of course, the economic links between Australia and India is not as naturally complementary as the economic links between Australia and Japan and Australia and China. But it is a nation that will bulk very large in the region and the world as years go by. And unlike China, and markedly unlike China, India does not have a demographic challenge. Let me leave you with a statistic on that front. So I recall correctly from a McKinsey study for the United Nations, the age cohort of 16 to 25 is the largest of that age group in India anywhere in the world, and it neatly exceeds the total population of Indonesia. So it gives one an idea of where India sits in relation to demography. I can't, of course, conclude my remarks tonight without saying something about current concerns in relation to China's behaviour in the South China Seas. I think this issue should continue to be dealt with in the patient but firm manner thus far exhibited by both Australia and the United States. We should not forget that in this dispute, China has few regional friends, and she's come into conflict with Vietnam and the Philippines and other nations in the region. Principles should not be compromised, but likewise we should guard against overreaction and not assume for a moment that China believes it is in her interests for the situation to deteriorate. And to those who fret about the possibility of conflict, it is useful to recall the long saga of the quarrel decades ago between China and Taiwan over control of the Kinmen and Matsu Islands. This dispute, which related to some islands just offshore from the mainland and under Taiwanese control, started not long after the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. And as late as 1979, shelling on alternative days continued. And conflict between the United States and China was feared on numerous occasions, yet it did not eventuate. Now, I don't suggest that the circumstances are completely analogous, but nonetheless, that earlier dispute is a reminder of the need to keep the current dispute in perspective. The growth of the Asian middle class is of colossal ongoing significance to Australia. We have gained from resource trade magnificently. We now, as a nation, face the challenge of transitioning to a greater reliance on services such as education, health, and recreation and entertainment. We should not make the mistake in embracing that transition of thinking that the resource trade is coming to an end. Far from it. It is obviously more difficult now for a combination of reasons, including the slowdown in the Chinese economy and the language state of many other parts of the world economy. But it still remains a dominant part of our trade and will continue to do so for decades into the future. There are two things that we should keep in mind in relation to that transition. The first is that we should maintain an open door to foreign investment. The attitude of the public can wax and wane on foreign investment. I remember when I entered Parliament in 1974, many people at that time expressing concern that Detroit controlled the motor manufacturing industry of Australia. Most Australians now would go on their bended knees to welcome a situation where Detroit was once more reinvesting in our motor vehicle industry. We went through a period of people expressing alarm about Japanese foreign investment in this country. And that, of course, has thankfully passed. Of course, there will be Chinese investment in Australia. There should be. It should be treated in exactly the same fashion as investment from other countries, and we would do ourselves an enormous disservice if we didn't continue our current openness towards foreign investment, providing the rules are followed and they're applied fairly and uniformly and without discrimination. We should welcome foreign investment from anywhere in the world. And the final thing is that if there's one thing I learnt from my experience as Prime Minister was that the stronger Australia was economically, the more she was respected in our region and around the world. And the fact that we were able to provide assistance to a number of Asian countries after the Asian economic meltdown between 1997 and 1999 enhanced our standing, won us new respect, and inevitably gave us more influence. I know it's a regular description used of things, but it nonetheless is appropriate. It is an exciting time to be Australia in relation to the nations of Asia. We are superbly placed if we get it right. Getting it right means that we have to keep our own house in order. We have to understand and respect the different attitudes and cultures and histories and institutions of the nations of Asia, but we should also continue to respect our own history, our own institutions, our own cultures and our own beliefs. I have never encountered an Asian leader who respects an Australian leader who seeks to trade away what we have done for the benefit of mankind and what we have believed in and what we have stood for. So respecting others in international relations also, in my view, carries with it an obligation to respect and cherish what we have distinctively achieved as Australians. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Howard, for what was an extremely insightful, thought-provoking speech. I'm sure it's going to elicit a number of questions. Mr. Howard's agreed to take a number of questions for the next few minutes, and I can already see a large number of hands shooting up. So, yes, the gentleman in the middle. There are a couple of roving mics. It might be helpful as well if you introduced yourself when you ask your question. Thank you.
Excuse me for approaching you. I'm a bit deaf, so I'll...
Mr. Howard, thank you so much for your wonderful speech this evening. My name is Ashutosh Mishra, and I'm at the T.C. Burns School of Law in the University of Queensland. Mr. Howard, I moved to Australia in 2007. And before that, I was in India, in New Delhi, with the strategic think tank of the Ministry of Defense. And I've seen your leadership and your government from New Delhi also. And I can say, and I must commend your government and you for bringing that surge in India-Australia relations since the early 2000s, and there has been enormous goodwill in New Delhi for you and your regime and what you have done to India-Australia relations, sir. My question pertains to the role of leadership per se. Mr. Howard, around the world we see the importance of strong leadership in taking bold decisions, in shaping foreign policy. In Australia, what we have witnessed on both sides of the political divide, do you think these frequent leadership changes impede Australia's capacity to sort of frame and build very strong and consistent and decisive foreign policy? Thank you.
Well, we all have our prejudices when it comes to leadership changes. You mentioned 2007. Well, you know, I won't go any further. That was my last year. But look, it is different if you're talking about the current, the recent Australian experience. But I think countries do go through phases, and I think one of the reasons why there's been less stability, let me put it that way, or continuity in leadership recently, is that politics in this country, and I'm sure it's true elsewhere in the democratic world, politics in this country now is a lot less tribal than it used to be. People move around more. When I was growing up and getting involved in politics, I thought there was a 40-40-20 rule. 40% always voted Labor, 40% always voted for the coalition, and 20% moved around in the middle. I now have a feeling it's 30-30-40, and you see it everywhere. You see it manifested in what's happening in the United States. I mean, that's not the only explanation. I think we shouldn't be too hard on political parties and recent leaders, and just try and understand that there is a lot more volatility, and of course, those who've studied Australian politics will go back to the late 1960s. You had a long period of government by Menzies, and then he retired, and then Holt tragically drowned, and then you had three. You had Gorton, and then he was replaced by McMahon, and then Whitlam defeated McMahon in 1972. So there was a lot of instability in the government side, the coalition side, in the late 1960s, following a very long period. And of course, the Labor Party through that period had gone through extraordinary divisions. So we shouldn't imagine that you flick back, Arnold, just recently, you've had a golden age of continuing stability. I mean, you did have a long, the Hawke, then followed by Paul Keating, who was his treasurer. That was 13 years, and then my government was in power for almost 12 years, and we had a lot of stability. You had the same three people, Prime Minister, Treasurer, Foreign Minister, during that time. But I think you've got to take a very long view, but it is different now. It's less tribal, and when things are less tribal, they're less predictable.
Another question. Yes, we have a gentleman back to the floor. Just raise your hand, please.
Hello, my name is Mick Fox. I'm an undergraduate from Griffith University. You highlighted within your speech the importance of the relationship with Indonesia and how that dynamic has changed over the period of time. How would you suggest that the Australian government move forward in cultivating that relationship?
Well, I think the relationship is in reasonable shape, better than reasonable at the present time. One of the things that was very plain to me was that in many of the Asian countries, there was enormous store placed on the personal contact with the head of government. And I remember when Bob Carr became Foreign Minister in the Gillard government, he paid me and other former Prime Ministers the courtesy of calling and saying, "Have you got any advice?" And I said, well, you should get the Prime Minister, who was then Julia Gillard, to pay a visit to Beijing as soon as possible, because the Chinese government places a great store on the head of government contact. I developed a very good relationship after a difficult start with Jiang Zemin, who was the president of China between he was president before I became Prime Minister, and he stayed there till 2003, and he visited Australia, and we used to meet at regional gatherings and the like, and that was quite a valuable thing, and I know that Tony Abbott developed a very good relationship with Mr. Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, and I'm not saying he didn't have good relations, and Malcolm Turnbull doesn't have good relations with others as well, but it's although they're very dissimilar, these countries, and I made that point in my speech, a common thread of dealing with Asian countries is that their leaders do place great store. And of course, in many of them, where they don't quite have the regularity of polls, people are in power for a set period of time. I mean, Jiang Zemin had 10 years, Hu Jintao had 10 years, and I reckon Xi Jinping will have at least 10 years. He's very, very dominant. So I think but Malcolm Turnbull has clearly developed in a short period of time a good relationship with Jokowi, the new president of Indonesia, and former President Yudhoyono was in Australia recently, and we renewed our friendship then. But so I think the relationship is good, but it's always going to be hard, the relationship with Indonesia. I mean, it's the largest Islamic country in the world. It's much bigger than Australia population-wise. It's a different stage of economic development. There are always going to be some sensitivities. But when you think what the relationship has been through, I mentioned the elements in '64, and of course the difficulty we had over Timor. The fact that we survived that relationship, that difficulty was a tribute to the fundamental goodwill. And a lot of that, can I say, derives from the beneficial effect of the Colombo Plan. It was really quite moving to go to Asian countries and to be reminded that 2 or 3 ministers in the government had been to universities in Australia. I mean, it's a terrific thing, I found that very warming.
Got one question here, and I'll take you at the back. Thank you.
Arthur Poropat, I'm here as a member of Griffith University's Council, and that's what's driving the question. As you've been talking about Australia's role in interacting with Asia, what would you like to see universities doing to contribute to Australia's future in that interaction?
Well, I'm in favour of, and this is not something entirely within the remit of universities. It involves government. I'm in favour of universities having generous admission policies in relation to Asian students. I'm in favour of those that find it feasible and economically sustainable to open campuses. There are a few of them. One of the interesting experiences I had was to go to a graduation ceremony in former Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, for Melbourne MIT, and it was a great experience. And because the link there is very strong, and I think after a French university, my recall is that MIT was the next one that was actually allowed to establish in Vietnam. I think courses that emphasise the importance in a balanced way of our relationship, I think they are contributions that all Australian universities can make. We've got to make the question of Asian languages. Well, I think, of course, they should be encouraged, but of course that is more something that rests with the primary and secondary education system in the first instance.
Okay, we have one last question, and then Fraser will have to wrap up this evening. So, gentleman in the middle. Have to locate at the back there. Yeah, that's right.
Associate Professor Andrew Phillips from the University of Queensland. Mr. Howard, thank you very much for your presentation. Towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned the importance of India in Australia's engagement with the region. But you also made a very important point about the fact that India generally had a very different foreign policy posture to Australia for much of the Cold War, and today it continues to favour a very strong position of strategic autonomy. So I was just very curious to get your sense, Mr. Howard, of where you conceive the role of India within Australia's grand strategy of engagement with the region. Is India primarily of value to Australia as a market? Is it more valuable as a potential strategic counterweight to China? Where do you see the scope of that relationship evolving in Australia's engagement with the region?
Of course, I'm not sure that we need to have a grand strategy with Asia. I mean, part of the thesis of my address is that our association is the sum total of successful, strong bilateral relationships. Obviously, Australia and India have a number of fundamentals in common. We have a common history through the British Association. We are federations. We have largely the same, not entirely the same legal systems. We obviously have a passionate interaction and engagement in a great sport. I think I can safely say that, talk about cricket as being a great sport. I won't start picking differences in relation to football codes. I think you ought to remember that there's a seamlessness about our cultural and political interaction with India, which is very, very valuable. And of course, the language thing is also extremely significant. But you were right that while the Cold War waged, we were at a distance because of the stance that India saw herself as the quintessential non-aligned country, and her default position, if it wasn't non-alignment, it was pro-Soviet. I mean, that's the truth. But paradoxically, she continued to be a strong democracy. I think there's a lot of economic potential. And of course, I think I'm right in saying that last year, the migration flows from India were greater than from any other. I think they actually were ahead of China's last year. So certainly there's very strong migration flows, and that's contributing on a people-to-people basis. But India is a hugely different society in so many other ways. I think we will do well in relation to Asia, and I don't see this as a grand strategy. But where countries have demonstrated a very strong commitment to liberal democratic institutions, I don't think we should be frightened to mention that and to emphasise that. I thought one of the really good things that came out of the foreign policy of the Bush administration was the trilateral security dialogue between Australia and Japan and the United States. It was a way of saying to countries in Asia that were more authoritarian, well, we have these things in common. This is not directed against you, but it celebrates something that we have in common. And I know at one stage it was thought that maybe India should join it because she also had a strong democratic tradition. Now that's fallen by the wayside. I don't think it's going to be resurrected. But India has a lot of values in common with Australia at a whole of country level, and I think they can be developed. But there's not the economic complementarity, and I don't think it's going to develop. And I certainly, it can get better than it is, but I don't think it's ever going to match the economic complementarity of the relationship with Japan and Australia and China and Australia. And don't forget Korea. Korea's been a tremendous customer of this country for a long, long time.
Mr. Howard, thank you for what was an outstanding talk this evening. It was, in effect, a masterclass, one in which you brought to bear the tremendous knowledge and experience of the Asia region that you've accumulated over your distinguished career, and most especially while as Australia's Prime Minister. We would very much now like to present you with a gift from us in appreciation of the talk you've given. Appropriately, it's signed copies of books by Professor Colin Baccaras and Professor Pat Weller.